Am I
Yes.
audible? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope you're keeping well. So I'll be starting with a short introduction on Delhi Comparatist, and then we'll be handing over the thing to Charu. So Delhi Comparatist is an initiative in the direction of studying Indian literary scenario with the themes of transmediality and interdisciplinarity, serving as the cornerstones. Started back in 2010 by teachers and students of University of Delhi, this group's primary thrust is to develop a critical understanding of the cultural, social, political dynamics in multicultural Indian landscape. All our content and forthcoming events and research projects embrace literary themes like comparative studies, literary historiography, pluralistic epistemology, margocentrism, digital humanities, and so on. We empathetically endeavor to create a sustainable and socially relevant hub that engages with and enhances the tools, methodology, theory, and approaches analogous to these dynamically interactive areas of study. In that vein, the subgroup of rhetoric studies manages to investigate the quintessential role of language, symbols, and signs in organization and sustenance of social groups, construction of meanings and identities, creation of knowledge and production of change in any community, particularly in South Asia, where multicultural societies constantly find themselves at the fringes of experiencing the fundamental change. Thank you, everyone. I would like to just hand over the stage to Charu.
Thank you, Kriti. A very warm welcome to everyone. We have Professor Keith with us today, and this is his second talk with the Delhi Comparatists. So I will just quickly introduce him, although he doesn't need any introduction, but I'll still go ahead with it. So Dr. Keith is a professor of English at Kent State University, Stark. He's a chair of the Non-Western or Global Rhetoric Standing Group of College Composition and Communication, and he's also the executive director of the International Association Intercultural Communication Studies. His research articles have been published in prestigious journals like Rhetoric Review, Rhetoric Society Quarterly, College English Association Forum, Journal of Advanced Composition, Intertexts, and the Foreign Language and Literary Studies, and the Advances in the History of Rhetoric. His talks on different global platforms comprise of a fascinating discussion on comparative rhetoric, the rhetoric of India, feminist argumentation, and the argumentation theory. He's recently published a book, which is in 2020, which is titled Rhetoric and Composition Studies. So, as I said, this is a second talk of Dr. Keith with Delhi Comparatists. In his first talk, he discussed, in detail with very vivid examples, the 16 categories of Nyaya Sutra, establishing Nyaya rhetoric as an alternative or rather a more productive rhetoric in comparison to the ones that focus on mere winning. So he sees Nyaya rhetoric as something which is essentially helpful in exploring and understanding the practices central to specific regions, cultures, and communities. With this brief about Dr. Keith and his work, now I would hand over this virtual platform to him. Over to you, sir.
All right, thank you. I am going to go ahead and load up my slides. Just a second. I don't know why it skipped all the way there. Okay, there we go. Okay, can you see comparative rhetoric on the screen?
Yes, okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I like to keep it so that I can also see your faces, so that I'm not just talking into a black box.
Okay, okay. Yeah, sure.
All right, so today I'll be talking about comparative rhetoric with a really cool slide background. And what I want to emphasize is the recovery describing welcoming local, regional, indigenous communicative practices. So let me start. Charu, thank you for your wonderful introduction. So thank you to the organizers of this and Kriti. Also, for training and inspiration, I'd like to thank, let me also thank my assistant, Hannah Jones. I'd like to thank Uma Krishnan, who was responsible for a lot of my training in Nyaya philosophy, Dr. Luming Mao, who's been a mentor to me in the field, and Ambika, who is here today just as an encourager and friend. Thank you. So for some context on my remarks, she kind of hit everything. But here are my two most recent books, and the fact that in 2005, beginning in 2007, and by 2017, the idea of Nyaya rhetoric was accepted by Indian philosophers as a legitimate approach to understanding. Once I think I made it clear that I wasn't trying to say that it was just rhetoric, that it was a philosophy, but it also had rhetorical origins and implications. So today I want to talk about comparative rhetoric, the landmark texts. The first was Robert Oliver's Communication and Culture in Ancient India and China. Fascinating book. I remember when I first read it, it really changed my thinking a lot about a lot of things. Then George Kennedy put out one that was more where he kind of framed the name comparative rhetoric in the title of his book. And went and looked at some other rhetorical practices in different places in the world. And he came up with a very broad theory of rhetoric, which is very interesting, that I don't have a lot of time to go into today. But the next two books, it took quite a while before we started really seeing some traction on this. So 2004, 2009, we had two anthologies. And then Luming Mao put out another anthology, 2014. And then my book kind of is the first one to the largest anthology to date with almost 40 authors. So we're extending the idea of comparative rhetoric. So little background. I'm bragging on the people in my book, not just my book. I know it's not just a shameless plug. I'm bragging on the fact that all these different people brought into the field, my field, Chinese, Asiatic, Turkish, Egyptian, Jewish, Hindu, Vedic, Buddhist, Arabic, Muslim, Indonesian, African, Filipino, Japanese, Jesuit, Indigenous, American, and feminist hybrid rhetorics. So I'm grateful to the authors who contributed to that book and expanded our knowledge of these rhetorics. So they also talk about the relationship of cultural rhetorics, intercultural rhetoric, cross-cultural rhetorics, teaching, transnational studies, translingual studies, and general rhetorical theory. Don't ask me any questions about that. I'm not sure about all those distinctions sometimes, but those are the various fields that do similar work. So let me talk first about, in part one, about what comparative rhetoric is. In my view, rhetoric is the study, the shaping of the relation, the message, and the delivery. So the what and the how in communication in human, and I believe in animal environments. I believe that animals also are rhetoricians in some sort of senses. All right, so comparative rhetoric focuses on rhetorics outside of neglected by Greco-Roman tradition, including the rhetorics of post-colonial environments. Okay, I believe that it responds to the needs of our time. This was a colleague of mine that recently passed, and we all miss her greatly. One of her contributions was to be, I think, a prophet of our field, and statements like this. The virtue of cross-cultural and comparative studies in rhetoric is that the dangers of preserving the other as an other can be minimized by recognizing or creating common ground, common language, an objective that becomes increasingly important in our current climate of resurgent nationalisms and related polarized identities. All right, let me go back a little bit in terms of the beginnings. As I talked about a little bit last time, the term comparison implies that you already know something that you're comparing to. And for us in the field, it is Oliver and Kennedy's discussions and application of Greco-Roman perspectives to the comparative field. But the problem is that can lead to misleading equivalencies and misinterpretations. Oliver and Kennedy were both aware of these issues, and they tried to nudge us away from them. But with not as much success as later people. So those first two books at least established the idea of comparative rhetoric. At first, comparative rhetoric featured historical recoveries from ancient periods, and most often it was China. In 2004 and 2009, which I already talked about, these two books added different forms of rhetorics, different studies of rhetorics, so they expanded the idea to Middle Eastern, Egyptian, Chinese, biblical, etc. Wait, let me go back. Biblical, Indian, Irish, and alternate Greek rhetorics. All right, so then things really took off about 2013. There was a meeting with stakeholders in the field, and they published a piece in Rhetoric Review called Manifesting a Future for Comparative Rhetoric. And they set up certain tenets of the field. Comparative rhetoric examines communicative practices across time and space. Communicative practices frequently originating in non-canonical context, often in marginalized, forgotten, dismissed as anything but rhetoric, and are erased altogether. Goals were to promote a practice and a way of doing and knowing and being that moves away from defining and claiming a finite set of objects of study that transcends borders, binaries, and biases. In other words, we want to have a field of rhetoric that no longer really has a sense of borders, not just confined to Greece or ancient Greece or the Euro-American context. The methodology, comparative rhetoric, practices the art of recontextualization. I'll spend a few slides talking about what he means by that. I agree with him on this approach. As he says, we have to begin somewhere, and so we begin with our own knowledge of Greek rhetoric. Usually that's how we get into the field in the first place, is through our interest in that. And the best way to do that, as Mao and others have pointed out, is to immerse yourself as far as possible in the other's world, describe as best their practices in their own terms within their own context. Later on, we'll see that he talks about what that means, especially for a person, say, from China or from India, who is doing this kind of practice. It's a little bit different relationship, because the relationship to Greek rhetoric is not what it is in a Euro-American context. So he talks about that later. As he notes, we may not have any choice but to articulate other rhetorical traditions first by seeking out frames and terms found in our own tradition. So we may look for things like debate in something like a poetic tradition, just to see if there's something there. But our larger goal is to study these traditions in their own terms. All right. So he defines this as reflective encounters. We study other traditions in order to develop an ongoing dialogue between these other traditions and Western rhetorical tradition. So we're not just trying to study the other tradition as an other, but to place it in dialogue with the Greek tradition. These reflective encounters, practice of which is an art of recontextualization, expand our understanding of the field of rhetoric ourselves and the object under study. All right, so for rhetors who are nurtured in the rhetorical tradition, so he means people who grew up in the West in the Euro-American tradition, and that is a part of their background. For those people, like me, for rhetoricians matured in the Western rhetorical tradition, a productive interrogation of their own tradition, their own privileged position, and they're very often well-meaning representations of the other, which I've gone through a lot in my life. The things that I go into expecting when I'm entering an environment like Indian rhetoric, reevaluating, constantly recontextualizing, rethinking. Am I seeing what's really happening, or am I seeing it on my own terms? Am I able to see it in other terms? That sort of thing. In this matter, there is not much room left for the logic of Orientalism, which of course relates to my previous talk. Now, for rhetors who begin as the other, for example, someone in India who is studying Greek rhetoric, a little different in India because of course the British tradition, the Raj, would make it, I think, a little more a part of the background than it might be in China. But for rhetoricians whose rhetorical traditions are the other, who represents the other, reflective encounters yield a willingness to complicate their representations even though they're already considered native. So it's always a process of recontextualization. No matter where you begin, whether you begin in India or China or Africa, or you begin in Euro-American context. So what does this mean for me? As my studies in Greek rhetoric in India have shown me, the idea that ancient Greeks were Westerners is inherently problematic. Again, I'm going to quote Jan Swearingen. Contemporary discussions of the other increasingly invite us to reconsider these ancient discussions of the one and the many, and of the hidden order and harmony in the universe that was perceived in strikingly similar ways by ancient Indian, Chinese, Near Eastern, and pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. I might mention a lot of indigenous American cultures as well. So what makes it Western? That's questionable. It's up for debate. So another thing that we're questioning, the whole idea of East and West. The opposition of East and West not only relies on what Said referred to as Orientalism, it also relies on very one-sided interpretation of Occidentalism. This is, again, Lu Mingmao speaking. So he says, the process of studying one's own rhetorical and cultural experiences is always a process of recontextualization. As a result, the danger will be greatly diminished of reverting to the logic of Occidentalism, a derivative of Orientalism, a logic that perpetuates the same kind of ethnocentrism, dogmatism, and dualism as does the logic of Orientalism. Okay, so both things begin to dissolve from a study of comparative rhetoric. All right, so let's reflect a little bit. The study of comparative rhetoric brings both of these fictional perspectives, Oriental and Occidental, into question. We begin to remap the world, literally. Even the idea of rhetorical tradition, a straight line from the Greeks to the democratic West, is under deep scrutiny. Patricia Bazell's written on this. Susan Jarrett, Arabella Lyon has written some brilliant stuff on the fact that there isn't a line. There were times that the West wasn't teaching rhetoric, and it was more known in the Arabic world than it was in the Western. So how can we say it's a Western tradition? All right, part two. This is the fun part, where we are recovering, we're describing, we're welcoming local and regional indigenous communicative practices. This is my clumsy attempt to describe some of those processes. And hopefully I will pronounce things right. Comparative writers look for historical rhetorical patterns of communication. They may be written or unwritten concepts of discourse, debate, theories of language, poetics. We look in a lot of different places. My friend in Egypt, Hani Rashwan, looks a lot at Arabic poetics, but studies it from a rhetorical perspective. Comparative rhetorists also look for contemporary rhetorical patterns and examples. Lu Mingmao does a lot of this, looking in contemporary China. Arabella Lyon does that. My approach combines the search for historical traditions with the examination of contemporary speeches and text. And in my case, I look for examples of Nyaya Hindu rhetoric. No big surprise there. Okay, so in terms of recovering and describing, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This is an example from that Upanishad. As you know, this predates actually the Socratic philosophers. Kennedy identifies the Upanishads as the best examples we have of debate in the period before 5th century BCE, as does Oliver. The thing is that both of them interpret the particular passage I'm looking for is the teacher's attempt to build his reputation by winning. And this isn't an unusual interpretation. A lot of Nyaya scholars talk about that was the function of debate in the ancient world. But I also want to look at it from more of a Nyaya perspective to think, is that really what's happening, or is something else happening at the same time? All right, so if we look at the Upanishad, I knew I would mess up. Okay, let's just say the Brahmin is talking. I'm feeling some pressure to try to pronounce these things correctly in front of this audience.
It's Yagavalka, but okay, it doesn't matter.
Yes, thank you for helping me. All right, so he's a Brahmin. He's speaking to a Kshatriya king, Janaka. And basically, it is a debate contest where he stands to win some cows, some cattle, some property. And he says this because he's being asked to teach about dreaming and waking and dreamless sleep. They're in a discussion. So he says, that entry, Purusha, after enjoying himself and roaming in the dream state and merely witnessing the results of good and evil, hastens back in the reverse way to his former condition, the waking state. We all just experienced that, or at least I did on my side of the planet when I woke up this morning. He remains unaffected by whatever he sees in this state, for this infinite being is unattached. So he's comparing what is in us, this eternal state, this eternal part of us that is just watching ourselves in the dream state. So he gets 1,000 cattle. But he goes on, as he's told to. He says, that entity, Purusha, after enjoying himself roaming in the waking state and merely witnessing the results of good and evil, hastens back in a reverse way to his former condition, the dream state or dreamless sleep, as a large fish swims alternately to both banks of the river. If you were here for the last talk, you're already thinking that's a Nyaya argument. Because he's talking about, and I love it that he uses exactly the same language the second time. So the message is pretty clear, even just by the language, that we should be as unaffected by what happens to us in the daytime as in dreams, as a large fish swims alternately to both banks of the river. So in terms of recovering and describing, I see a Nyaya argument here. The Purusha reverses to its former condition because this infinite being is unattached, as a large fish swims alternately to both banks of a river. And then we actually see the Nyaya process when they agree and he gets his cows and asks for more instruction and liberation. So everything about Nyaya that I talked about last time, they focus on a shared perspective, a knowing episode, but leading to moksha, liberation. This is all happening in this discussion. So we could see it as a Greek debate, but I think it's just as important to see it as an example of a Brahma, a knowing episode. Okay, I put too many words on here, but let me sum up. And this happens often in the Upanishads, that there are discussions. And often what happens, the pattern is very interesting in the sense that it's very dialogical. So one person might insert part of the argument. And often in the Upanishads, it is the listener who offers the example, the drishtanta, that makes the connection. So what I think we see in the Upanishads is the Nyaya in its beginnings as a dialogic rhetorical method. Okay, here's a modern example. And I just happened to stumble on this when I was researching something else, and I thought this is very interesting because this is in a completely different context, and yet I see it in the Nyaya argument. So one of the things that Nyaya says in the sutras is the character of an object of right knowledge resembles that of a balance by which a thing is weighed. So Nyaya literally means like to hold up a plumb line. So this is from an economist writing in India, and she's talking about Indian government economic liberalization. 1991 was a huge accomplishment, but after 25 years of liberalization, the benefits of growth have failed to trickle down. So this is an example of what they call trickle-down economics. It doesn't trickle down to the lower income groups in India. Higher economic growth doesn't necessarily result in job creation and the consequent reduction in poverty. For instance, even with a growth rate of 7.6 in the Indian economy, 2015 experienced a 68% slowdown in jobs created. Okay, you're probably thinking, where's the Nyaya argument? Here it comes. So one of the things it says in the Nyaya Sutra, application is a winding up with a reference to the example of Drishtanta, of what is to be established as being so or not so. So it says basically, if the analogy, the Drishtanta, does not work, the whole argument fails. So Mittal focuses on the Drishtanta, the driving analogy, and suggests rather than wealth trickling down, which is from a water analogy, she says the theory has rather a topple-down effect. I love the play on words on the economy. It fails to generate desirable effects and instead clogs the economy with chronic poverty. So I see this as a Nyaya argument in a completely different context than you might expect. Trickle-down economics clogs and the whole concept topples down. But as Uma taught me when I was learning about this, it's a very common method in Indian argumentation to use a lot of analogies, and I think it's a direct remnant of Nyaya reasoning. So in Nyaya reasoning, to show the inadequacy of the analogy is a death blow to the whole school of thought behind it. And I think it's interesting that Mittal seems to kind of instinctively know, if I question the whole analogy that drives the trickle down, I've thrown into question the whole idea of whether it's worth it. All right. I think what results is kind of a double consciousness, where neither is trying to win in both arguments that we look at. And both are trying to reset our thinking in a larger perspective beyond our separateness. And we can see both of these passages as examples of Greek debate, but at the same time, we can hear echoes of Nyaya reasoning resonating through thousands of years. All right then. What about the welcoming part? Becoming aware of indigenous rhetorical practice not only enables a new rhetorical perspectives, it encourages fresh perspectives on pressing problems within the indigenous environment. So I'm going to offer two examples. During the Raj, the British had imposed Western structures on Indian society. I don't think I need to explain that to the audience here. The new doubled consciousness allows an appreciation and a reevaluation of indigenous practices like Nyaya, possibilities for blending old and new. So, two examples. Amartya Sen, actually, let me bring up who he is. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economic sciences, and you're probably familiar with him. He's written a lot on social choice theory. Whoops, gave that away. But let's back up. This is what he says. This is a critically important distinction in the history of theories of justice, including those in Europe and West. But I begin with a demarcation that has a clear role in Indian intellectual debates, Sanskrit literature on the subject, two distinct words, niti, nyaya, both of which stand for justice in classical Sanskrit, actually help us to differentiate between two separate concentrations. Among the principal uses of the term niti are organizational propriety and behavioral correctness. In contrast with niti, the term nyaya stands for a more comprehensive concept of realized justice. I can't help but think, wow, just all through the centuries, this idea has conveyed. So he's talking about this law of the fish ordering of society, where the big fish eats the smaller fish. A realization focused Nyaya perspective makes it easy to see the importance of the prevention of manifest injustice in the world rather than focusing on the search for perfection. That would be niti to him. As the example makes clear, the subject of justice is not merely about trying to achieve or dreaming about achieving some perfectly just society and social arrangements, but about preventing manifestly severe injustice. So he's talking about just removing the obstacles that enable the reality where the big fish eat the smaller fish. So Nyaya is about removing obstacles to justice in this view. I just immediately thought of a 19th century abolitionist. Actually, she's quoted by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and you may have heard this quote recently after she passed away. or if you saw the documentary on her. But I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God designed us to occupy. To me, that is such a good example of what he means by nyaya, is that it isn't, you know, I don't need anything but just to stop, to allow, to remove the obstacles to equality. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg quotes this: I ask no favor of my sex, all I ask of my brethren to take our feet off our necks. This also became extremely relevant in the George Floyd killing in the United States, where he was actually killed by a police officer by leaning on his neck. And so this took a double resonation in American culture. I'm sure you can think of examples that you have heard in your own surroundings. The other part I wanted to talk about is the Nyaya Panchayats. This is an idea that there were these village councils for thousands of years that kind of appear and disappear over time, but basically stayed pretty steady until the time of the Mughal Empire, and then up into the British period. The British tried to reinstate them. It didn't really work. But after independence, then the Indian government and the Constitution reestablished them. And I know that it's met with some mixed success, but what I think is interesting here is that we have an example of how within the indigenous culture that Nyaya originates, and there's this effort to reinstate some of these traditions that have gotten a little bit lost and obscured. But I do think it also means a double vision. These things might not work as they did in different environments. They probably need some tweaking. I think you guys know more about it than I do, but it did reach constitutional status. and on many village levels, these are established councils where people can come as a first level, where you don't need a lawyer. They're basically kind of arbitration negotiation courts, so that a lot of issues get taken care of without a lot of expense or travel. All right, so let me sum up. Comparative rhetoric begins with a knowledge of Greek rhetoric, and then engages in practices of understudied and non-Western environments in reflective encounters. It describes practices of the other as much as possible in their own terms, and in some ways is erasing the boundaries of self and other. Expands the understanding of our understanding of rhetoric, and it leads to an understanding and valuing of indigenous rhetorical methods that can deeply enrich the home culture as well as the field of rhetoric. Ultimately, its goal is to recover, describe, and welcome local, regional, indigenous communicative practices as integral aspects of global rhetorical history and study. And thank you.
Thanks, Keith, for this engaging and also, I would say, thought-provoking points. I mean, I have already filled 2 pages of thoughts about which we can continue to argue. But okay, anyway, because I'm moderating this question answer session, so I'm inviting participants to raise their questions, because we are not, we have time, so please raise your questions, your comments and questions. Is there any comment or question? As the convener, I really don't want to take up all the time for discussion. Or you can put your questions in the chat box as well. Let me check whether there is any.
Thank you,
No.
Shreya.
There is no question over there. Okay. Kate seems we have an audience. We have an audience who are expecting us to discuss. So, I mean, how would you really compare between Oliver and Kennedy? Because somehow I found Oliver to be looking at the ancient Indian tradition without much knowledge of the texts, whereas Kennedy really did his homework very well.
I think it's a matter of just respect for an elder, someone who kind of began the field. But
no, but you see,
Kennedy,
that is an interesting thing in Indian tradition. I mean, Sanskrit knowledge tradition. So Abhinava Gupta, who was a poetician, so he wrote in the beginning of his book that, okay, I have talked and negated a lot of my predecessors' point. That's because I respect them.
Yes. I think Kennedy, as you said, did a lot more research. He had a deeper understanding, which was kind of amazing because he looked at more things, right, more aspects than just the two. But as I go, it's another part of that double consciousness. When I go back to Oliver, I find that he's more right than I thought he was the first time. That he sort of intuited some things that were valid. But in terms of just depth of understanding, Kennedy is astounding. And it's pretty amazing that he actually was a reviewer for one of my first publications. So that was a little scary when I found it out after. But I agree with you. In terms of the real beginning of the field, I would say it's Kennedy, because he really thought about what does rhetoric even mean. And I like that he put it almost, I think, almost in Indian or Hindu terms. He said it was an energy.
Yes. Right.
I've put it in one of my pieces that it's an impulse, that there is within us an impulse to communicate, to understand, to share. And rhetoric, I think, is a disciplinary name for that, for how we construct that impulse. And I think we do it differently in different cultures, of course, because of different environments. But I like this idea that it's energy, and therefore he sees animals as using rhetoric and like convincing each other to do things. It sounds a little strange, but it would make sense because, you know, we're human animals. There's not that great a distance in some ways between us and our surrounding fellows.
But I would also like to add to that, you know, don't you think that in Kennedy's understanding of rhetoric, there is a division, one group which belongs to be that conscious cultures, which practice rhetoric as well as conceptualize rhetoric and wrote on that.
Yes.
And another one who practiced rhetoric, but did not conceptualize and wrote on that.
Yeah, and I have a problem with that. For one thing, in some senses, he would have said that India would have been a place of the second type, whereas I see in the Nyaya Sutra, and also the Natya Shastra is being actually and even I think Kautilya, you know, some of the political theory, I see these as being rhetorical works as well, or the Karaka Samhita, that in the middle of the Ayurvedic text there is Nyaya discussed in some detail. So to me, he missed the boat in that sense. But also, Lu Mingmao in his work in China basically has kind of thrown out that opposition in saying maybe they theorized it in a different way. Did you look over in like Panini in India, like theories of language? If you look in there and you piece all that together, then you see, okay, here is a view of rhetoric, but you have to go to all these different sources. And Mao takes a similar approach. But even then, if you take an oral culture, a mostly oral culture, like many African cultures at some point, doesn't mean it wasn't necessarily kind of theorized in some sort of ad hoc way. It just means we may not have texts. But I think his division is very questionable. But I do think there probably were societies that didn't theorize at least about debate or whatever. I don't know. I think that's almost gone. I had too many Chinese colleagues who were saying, no, in China, because rhetoric happened with rulers, then a whole different way of theorizing debate, a whole different way of presenting ideas. And it's kind of a way to, you lead the person to think it's their idea. You start off with something harmless, and then that leads to, like a decision that's harmless. And then you lead that to another decision, and then the leader goes, oh, well, I think we ought to do this. So if you look for all of those things, and you look at literary theory, and you look at all these different things, then I think the map is quite different. And not to mention, I have colleagues like Kermit Campbell who, they're finding these amazing written works in Africa. So we have a lot of unearthing to do. Not to mention, I have a colleague who's doing a lot in Mayan pictograms. And we're just beginning to really, understand that as a language. So who knows? I mean, they theorized about everything else. I'm sure there's something there we're just missing because we might not be thinking of it in those kinds of terms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I might sound a bit snobbish, but okay, my problem with Kennedy was that if in my language there is not a book called like Rhetoric, the Rhetoric, then I may, like in African Oriki culture, from Oriki performances, you can assume the aesthetics. But when you talk of a knowledge culture, you either have the text or you have the practice. But anyway, that's a part of a longer debate which I have with my senior colleague a lot.
Short answer, I think he's wrong.
Yeah. But you have a few questions. Can you please look into the chat box?
Yes. It's a little hard for me to see. I have
okay. Then I'll read it out. The first question is from Tim Baker, who says that does using the term rhetorics to describe cultural communication practices carry too much Western ideological baggage for the field to fully embrace a broader and comparative mindset?
Yes and no.
Yeah,
in my last talk, I talked about this. I don't think rhetoric is a Greek term anymore. I just don't think so. I think every place that speaks English has a slightly different understanding of what it might even mean. But I definitely think it has a lot of baggage. I think the best article about that is by Arabella Lyon. And it's called Tricky Words. And so she basically says, if I could sum her up, and I wish she were here because she's such a marvelous speaker, but she basically says, it's the only word we have, really. And I want to put something else in its place, but whenever I do, that just seems like I might be doing this all over again. Like we just reified some other word. But Tim, I definitely understand what you're saying. I've been very hesitant to use the word comparative as well. I've tried to come up with alternatives, and I can't convince Lu Mingmao that we need to do that because he sees us as a cousin to all the other comparative approaches, thus this group. So he's saying if we pull the comparative out of our name, then we've lost that connection to comparative anthropology, comparative literature, comparative whatever that are happening all over the planet. So we're sort of trapped in that word. I prefer actually to call it polymorphic rhetoric, which means that at the same time, different species of the same thing kind of emerged. But I only got so much traction with that. So sympathize, I think the recontextualization is how we constantly are trying to keep ourselves from going back and making sure that rhetoric doesn't mean just argumentation or debate or Aristotle's handbook. And one of the reasons that I keep talking about Aristotle in my writings is because the journals always want me to. But I would just love to move on and just say rhetoric doesn't have anything to do with this guy anymore. It doesn't have to.
Okay, Kate, there is the next question from Keshav Bansal. Looking from a Foucauldian lens, how to negotiate tensions of rhetorical discourses, narratives in a comparative framework, when the problem is that of privileging of one over others by way of institutional academic edification, societal taboos, as well as distinction of madness and sanity, reason and non-reason, as he points out in his order of discourse.
Wow. You're merciless. Throwing me into Foucault. Wow. I don't know if I can come up with an easy answer or even an answer to that, but I love the question. And I talked about it just a little bit in the previous talk, this whole idea of the privileging through the dichotomy itself, the privileging of the one, the reifying of the one. Again, it seems to be an answer that is Lu-Ming Mao's recontextualization. That is a constant struggle to battle that reification. I don't know. I hope I'm answering this somewhat. I'm not sure I can at this point, but write me on ResearchGate, and maybe we can continue the discussion.
Sincerely, Keshav, it's an excellent question. I mean, the way we understand rhetoric and this question when it comes.
I actually am teaching Foucault in one of my classes right now. And that's probably why I don't feel prepared to quite respond to that fully, because I know what we're getting into is a complicated discussion. I might
add one thing, Kate, in this. This is a very interesting thing. I mean, so I'm teaching, like in this course, I'm teaching a medieval Bengali text about Bhakti Saint Chaitanya. So one of his hagiographies, which tries to ascribe all the post-Chaitanya theories to him. And there Chaitanya argues again and again that if I translate it in a mundane English, it's like, okay, I'm mad, you are mad, so let's talk. And then they continue to talk about theory. Keshav's question really reminded me of that. And that perhaps is a very interesting rhetorical strategy.
I definitely am fully in favor of exactly that. I think of myself as the Cheshire Cat when I'm teaching. We're all mad here. So that position of madness is a wonderful place to be in. Like nobody sees the world as it is. We're all speaking from a position of madness. But I like to say to my students, but some ideas are more helpful than others. Even the Cheshire Cat said, he said, which way where do you want to get to? And she says, I don't know. And Alice says, I don't know. And he says, well, then it doesn't matter which way you go. So he told her exactly the philosophical truth, speaking from a point of madness. So he was being helpful and mad at the same time.
Yeah, because at times when I mean, deifying Foucault, you forget that he really didn't talk of madness as blabbering. He talked of blabbering as arguing. But anyway, I mean, as a different paradigm, we'll get back to that. So Keshav has added Another problem is that of theory. Can there be a common theory for comparative culture inquiry in general and rhetorical in particular? Is it even desirable? I think you have answered to that, but okay.
I think I have. Wait, let's see. What you're talking about? KUHN, Kuhn? I don't see it.
Should I repeat it? Okay.
A common theory. Okay. In my book, my collection, Thomas Rickert actually ventures into that. The whole idea, at least a common rhetorical theory. And I'm not sure he and I actually agree, because I see it as, I think Oliver and Kennedy were coming from that kind of perspective that we could have this common rhetorical theory. I see a danger in that, and that it starts becoming an exclusionary force. So this is not rhetoric and this is rhetoric. So even in that, I welcome Thomas into the book. I like what he says. He kind of goes more the energy direction, and he uses a phrase called thrivance, that rhetoric should help us thrive in our environment. And he goes very environmental and ecological, and I think that's the best you can get for an overarching rhetorical theory. But at the same time, I'm nervous about reifying his view or anyone else's view as a unifying theory. We might end up just starting all over again in terms of now what is rhetoric, and then, you know, we've kind of reset the whole thing. So maybe if we're always moving it and shoving it around and changing it, then that would work. But I see it as a little dangerous to seek that. I don't think that's what we're seeking. I think we're trying to just become literate. And just like I'm literate, I'm computer literate, and I am poetically literate, etc. Those things don't mean that I have an overarching theory of all those literacies. Does that make any sense?
Keshav, if you want to interact, you can join us. Okay, Tim Baker said yes. But I mean, any of the participants who want to join in the discussion, you are free to join.
Hello, sir. May I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, if the question is for both of you. Question is for both Amitava Chakraborty and Dr. Lloyd. The question is very simple. Like, what is the goal? What should be, rather, the goal of rhetoric? Is it persuasion or realization? Now, I want answer from both Western and Eastern perspective. Eastern perspective, Dr. Chakraborty, you can take it up, as well as Western perspective, Dr. Lloyd.
Titash, I'm not taking up any question today because it's
no, I know. But the thing is, sir, you are aware of the Eastern understanding of rhetoric, right? That is the reason.
Titash, I won't really talk in terms of Eastern and Western, and I have noticed Keith has avoided that very consciously.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But Keith, yeah, it's your session. Please answer to this.
I think yes, that it is rhetoric. In one view is persuasion, but even the field of rhetoric has moved far away from that. And that most people who do rhetoric in the States and in Europe are looking at it through a broader lens, that rhetoric is about communication. It is a way of forming communication, like I said in the talk. So I don't see a binary there. I do prefer myself realization. I think that persuasion to me is kind of empty for a number of reasons. And Foss and Griffin talk about this in a piece called Invitational Rhetoric, that if your goal is to win, often you do that at the expense of the relationship, right? You argue the person down and they give up, but they don't often give in. And they don't often change when you do that. Also, if you just say, I'm right and you're wrong, well, then that's the end of that. So there's no persuasion happening there. But they talk about that the best persuasions happen with someone that you love, that cares for you. And I think all of us know that experience. Like my grandfather could have gotten me to do anything, right? My father, bam, I was fighting him all the time. But my grandfather would say one thing and I would just do it because I knew that he just loved me recklessly. He loved me without question. So they talk about that's a type of rhetoric where you have that relationship and you speak from that relationship and they know that, they understand that. And more often that's convincing. So that's not even really persuasion. It is kind of just an invitation. And so they say that the best kind, in their view, or at least the kind that rhetoric should seek, is invitational, which means I just state the way that I see it and invite you to see it that way too. And if you do or not, that's up to you. So I prefer that. I have colleagues that do argumentation theory, and to them, rhetoric is just about persuasion. We can all live together. But to me, it is so much more. It's about realization. It's about invitation. It's about sharing perspectives. It's not necessarily locked into that. In terms of East and West, it does seem that if we go with the metaphor of East, it is more often focused on realization. And in the West, more often on persuasion. But I think there are exceptions to that everywhere.
Thank you, sir. That was quite insightful. Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kate. If I can take a few moments of your session. Titash, when we talk of East, if you look into the textbooks that we publish in India about Eastern poetics, Eastern philosophy, you will find these are not Eastern. These are Sanskritic philosophies and Sanskritic texts. How do you understand East today? Even if you try to, I don't even call them Indian, because Indian poetics texts are like talking only about Sanskrit poetics. I mean, what is Indian? Because if we remember that when we got introduced to the Islamic culture, Arabic knowledge system had a big and very interesting tradition of rhetoric, how to speak publicly. And Buddhist texts particularly has a very interesting tradition of rhetoric, because if you look into the Buddhist monastery tradition, you will find they used to have votes, individual votes. There are specific terms for that. So I find it is becoming more and more problematic for us to talk in terms of Eastern and Western. There are lots of books where you will not find East, it's India, and that to Sanskritic India.
Right.
And that's why I would prefer to avoid this. This Eastern never addresses what happened when our elite learned Perso-Arabic traditions in so detail. Did they read the Arabic texts which talked about argumentation, poetics? We don't know. So I would prefer us to, I think when Kate was talking a few minutes back, I was feeling like we belong to a generation where we are trying to break this dichotomy of East, West, etc. It's time we talk of specific cultures. And
so
that
then
too,
do you...
Yeah,
sorry,
please.
sir. Sorry, please go on. Please go on.
Please. No, please. We want discussion. So please go ahead.
So then do you think that if I would have referred to specifically Vedic culture or Vedic tradition or Vedic literature, the question would have been more apt?
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Because, for example, right now I'm seeing a comment from USK that I can take that up. Eastern perspective, Nyaya Niti from ancient times, moving from Vedas to Upanishads to Gita to Ramayana to other modern texts. Well, I have a huge problem with that. First of all, if you look into the Vedas, in Vedas, even in the marriage mantras, they pray that let my wife argue in sabhas with me. I mean, not with me, but let her have the right to argue. By the time you enter the Brahminical period, you don't have, these mantras are there, but you don't have women who go and argue anymore. And Upanishads are a totally different thing compared to Vedas. Vedas are primarily prayers, and Upanishads are primarily dialogues. Bhakti-Jnana paradigm might explain it much better if we talk of Upanishads.
Right.
And then when you come to Gita and Ramayana, I mean, I don't see any argument in Gita. It's a question and answer. Unlike the question and answer, sorry, Kate, I'm taking a lot of your time. In Brahminical tradition, there is a sloka. How do you show respect to your teacher? And it says, pranipatana pariprashnena. So pranipatana means that you bow down to her, your teacher, wholly. And pariprashnena means that you question that person from all around. Right? It's a totally different philosophy. And when you come to the medieval Ramayana, we cannot come from Gita to Ramayana. Ramayana was an earlier text compared to Gita. But if you are coming to the vernacular Ramayanas, that's a totally different thing. There's total submission. Okay. Now,
Amitava, thank you for giving me an opportunity, and I'm glad you objected. This is Uma Krishnan. I'm a colleague of Keith, and I am just looking at it. The question that was posed was, does Nyaya look at realization? So I'm just bringing these books because the Nyaya Niti, the sutras that is started, it was from ancient times, and the main crux of these texts were realization, the self-realization. So the goal was the Nyaya leads to, on a personal level, it's self-actualization that leads to realization. So the question was, do we have to look at rhetorical books in terms of persuasion or realization? That's when I brought these books, not because I wanted to interject and say, no, there is nothing. There is that element of Nyaya in all these books. The purpose was, the core goal was realization. So that is the reason we use these texts, not because of anything else. And the thing is, Dr. Jha has written a great book, on this literature, and he talks about the evolution of these texts and what do they direct us towards. And it is all about moksha. So that is what was the main thing that I was pointing, not because I wanted to showcase anything else. I wanted to just answer the question. Yes, realization in these ancient texts was moksha, self-realization, and realization towards the path of godliness and looking at the aspect of Brahman within ourselves. So that is what I was trying to address. And it was rhetorical in the sense the subject matters were discussed with the audience to make them realize that this is what it is. After all, what are these texts exposing? So that's what I wanted to share. And you're absolutely right. You are what you're saying is absolutely true. And Kate, I apologize. I couldn't get in earlier because I had a student issue, which I had to take care of. You know my position at this point. So I missed out, and I hope, Amitava, we get a chance to hear, if this is recorded, would we be able to hear Keith? Or Keith, you can send it to me whichever way. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm Uma Krishnan, by the way. So I don't know how it comes in as USK, so I can't say.
No, it came just like that. But Uma, I understand what you were saying, though that excludes a very important tradition of those 67 schools of those who didn't believe in moksha in Indian tradition.
Yes.
But even if I accept this position, how would you explain Nigrahasthanas?
Okay, and by the way, thank you so much. You brought this back to again the Brahminical tradition. Oh, I love it. Being a Delhi University product, I can go right back to it. So, and I can tell you, by the way, so you're teaching, so you should know a lot of my
I teach literature. I teach comparative Indian literature.
That's okay. That's okay. Perfectly all right. So I just have to say, you talked about the Brahminical tradition of how you brought a very good point about how it is the marriage point changes over. And I have to bring this. Keith, you will agree with me. Anywhere the woman is, because a man succeeds, it's because a woman is behind him. So in Indian tradition, we are the people behind the wall, constantly prodding our men to be the best they can be. So you cannot, in a subtle way, the women have been given power. They might not have over a period of time explicitly come out into the open and voice their opinions, but women have played an integral role in the way policies, decisions, everything has been made. And even in marriages, women play a very important role, but behind the curtain. So I think you brought that. So Nyaya Niti, to begin with, Nyaya does say that in the Shastras, but yes, Brahmanical tradition changed over a period of time, but it is still there very much. Women play a very important role, in marriages and other parts. So they are equivalent to men. So that's why you have Vishnu and Lakshmi, you have Shiva and Parvati and Brahma and Saraswati, all equivalent. And if you see, Vishnu carries the woman in his heart. So how can you be negligent about that? So Keith, we have talked about this, if you remember, that women empowerment is very much there. So sorry about that. I got a little digressed, Amitava. So going back, sorry, go ahead. You were about to say something.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. You are Kate's teacher. Thanks a lot. Sorry, Kate, that we took a lot of your time. But thanks to that, you actually made us think and argue. Like, I was almost feeling like arguing back to Uma, but then I reminded myself it's your session, not Uma's session or my session.
I almost brought an example from the Upanishads that where it was a woman teaching a man.
Yeah, but you see, Kate, if we have to go into that, why do you have only one woman there or two women?
I'm not going to try to defend this.
Yeah. Okay, I can give an example.
I get your overall point that the relationships change. Yes.
So, is there any question? Okay, we'll wrap up in a few minutes. I think it's almost to more than 1.5 hours, more than 1 hour. But Kate, there is a question from Keshav. I have a proposition that of shift of perspective from speaker and in a dialogic structure from speaker, listeners to that of audience. Can we look at rhetoric by way of reception theory and reader audience response? I think a lot of rhetorical critics have already looked into that perspective. Anyway, Keith.
I actually just gave a talk on that to a different group. Again, if you contact me, I will just try to get you the video recording of it. I spoke to the International Association of Intercultural Studies. Short answer, yes. I think you can. I think that my work in Nyaya is helping me develop a dialogic model of rhetoric rather than a sender-receiver model. I think that's kind of what is the basic problem in Aristotelian rhetoric, is that he assumes that I am the rhetor and I know what's best for everyone, and it's my job to just put it in such a way that they will do what I ask. And there are times where that is an important function of rhetoric, but for the most part, I think rhetoric ought to be conversational, where people move together in dialogue, questioning, changing. Not necessarily Socratic dialogue, because I still think he was manipulative. I think Socrates always knew how it was going to go, and he just took them down the road. Where when I teach, I feel like I just want to set up an avenue and to just let it go and let it go where it will. And to me, that's what Nyaya has gotten me to thinking, that you could use debate in such a way that it's very invitational, interactional, dialogic. I think that's the kind of roots that it sprung up from. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks a lot, Kate. I mean, for such an engaging session. Charu, now we are
I
giving it to you.
also have like one small thing to say before we wrap up. Yeah.
Okay.
So I had a question and it eventually got answered during the discussion. I basically wanted to ask about the the dynamics of public sphere. Like, how do you see that during the medieval times when most of the vernacular traditions are moving away from the cosmopolitan Sanskrit texts and traditions? And my question was actually that, as to how to go about it. But then when you said that it is of it's more of invitational, and
Yes.
then eventually the realization and the persuasion will follow. So that kind of helped me understand what I wanted to ask you. So thank you for that. And
You're welcome.
Sir, we have one more question here from Shoma Mukherjee, but that's for you, which you missed. She asks if we can think about Sangam poetics in this particular context. I think that's the only one that we have left.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit different from what Kate has been talking today. Because if we accept that any type of poetics is also a rhetoric, then it's true. But then that's a different. But anyway, Kate, if you want to add anything.
The talk that I just mentioned, I talk a little bit about Satyanikran, which would be a theory of poetics, if you will, of course, of drama, of presentation. I do see a definite overlap, but I think that if we're going to have a full understanding of delivery, that part of that Aristotle called delivery, making what your message clear, then I think poetics has a lot to do with it, because there are a lot of terms that apply both to rhetoric and to poetics that we need to draw from. So I think there's a well of resources to be found there. I don't think they're equivalent, but I do think that studies in rhetoric shouldn't overlook poetics. That's why even Aristotle's Rhetoric is often published with the poetics, because you can get a fuller understanding of what he means by the terms, and you get a better understanding of rhetoric by the understanding of poetics. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, Kate, I think you said it right. Actually, I think Shoma asked this question also because Sangam poetry is conversational, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's why she found that to be more relevant. But
That would be
anyway,
interesting.
Yeah. So Charu, it's time to wrap up.
Yes. Okay, so I have shared the link to the Facebook page of our updates. If anyone is interested, please follow the link and you will be updated regarding the Delhi Comparatist events. And I thank, first of all, Professor Keith for all his time and for, working it out with us for the minor glitch that we had today for this particular talk. And thank you everyone for attending this session. Your presence has actually made it very engaging and,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate. And I think we'll be soon writing to you.
Yes, do that.
Seeking more cooperation. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this wonderful session.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great opportunity.
Thank you. So I'm closing the meeting now. Yeah. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming, Amrita.